By early to mid-May 1862, the situation surrounding the Hampton Roads area has become dire for the Confederate States of America. The cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth have fallen into Union hands, along with Gosport Navy Yard, which possessed one of the largest dry docks in the United States leading up to the Civil War. Whichever side managed to hold Gosport had quite the advantage. Losing these three objectives made quite the impact on the Confederacy. Citizens in this area felt abandoned, and they were now questioning the idea of the Confederacy. The Confederate troops were moved closer to Richmond, which meant the Union could just walk in and basically take the cities with no resistance, and losing Gosport meant that they lost the naval facility for one of their most powerful warships, the CSS Virginia. Now, it is worth mentioning that as the Confederacy abandoned these areas, they burned Norfolk and Gosport in an attempt to prevent the United States from getting supplies and using the facilities, but the Confederacy should have known this was going to fail, as the Union had tried the same thing in April of 1861. While the Union was taking Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Gosport, the Virginia's crew began watching the situation and piecing together what they could possibly do to counteract it. They decided that there were two possible solutions. They were either going to make a run towards Richmond using the James River, or they were going to sink the Virginia, whether it was in battle or via scuttling. One thing they decided they were not going to do was let the ship fall into Union hands. On the afternoon of May 10th, Captain Tattenhall held a conversation with Virginia's pilots, where they assured him they could safely navigate Virginia up the James River as long as the Virginia's draft was reduced to 18 feet and the wind was constantly blowing up the river instead of down it. Currently, the Virginia's draft resides comfortably at 23 feet since the vessel is nearly at full load. In order to get up the James River, they would have to reduce the draft by 5 feet, and the pilots calculated that they would have to throw approximately 300 tons of supplies overboard. The second option that was looked at was simply taking Virginia into battle with the Union blockade in the Hampton Roads area, but there were a handful of problems that popped up with Virginia's captain and officers that deterred them from this option. The first major problem is there are two major forts located in the area, and both of them are in Union hands. This would be Fort Wool and, most importantly, Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is currently acting as the center of operations for the Union side. President Abraham Lincoln has personally taken command of Union forces, and he is leading all operations in the Hampton Roads area from Fort Monroe, which is where he is currently residing with his staff. But there is also the Union blockade, which has been ordered to stay up against Fort Monroe since the Battle of Hampton Roads back in March of 1862, and within this blockade resides a familiar face. This is the USS Monitor. Virginia's leading staff decides that an engagement with the Monitor and the two forts at the same time would be disastrous for the Virginia, since the Monitor is staying near Fort Monroe, which places Virginia under the range of Fort Monroe's guns, which are shooting down on the Virginia, which is going to negate the sloped armor. Another problem Virginia's crew had to recognize with engaging the Monitor is the fact that they could not damage Monitor whenever they had the ability to shoot the little target. This meant that Monitor would have to be the primary focus of Virginia's fire, which would allow the Union wooden frigates in the area to freely engage Virginia, which only worsens the situation. With the idea of taking Virginia into battle being a suicide mission, they decided this was probably not the best option, and so they looked at possibly running Virginia through Hampton Roads without engaging the Union blockade and taking the vessel into the open ocean. Virginia's officers consulted Franklin Buchanan, whom was originally the flag officer of the Hampton Roads vessels, and he had commanded the Virginia personally on its first battle. He was very well aware of what the design's capabilities were, and he said that trying to make a run out of Hampton Roads would either result in the ship being destroyed by the two forts that had already been mentioned, or once when they were in the open ocean, the vessel would be taken down by simple nature, since the Virginia was not very seaworthy, and the vessel being caught in a storm would definitely result in its loss. With all of the options having been looked at, it was decided that Virginia would make an attempt to run up the James River within 40 miles of Richmond in an attempt to defend the capital from advancing Union forces. Virginia's 320-man crew was ordered to begin throwing supplies overboard. This ranged anywhere from drinks, ammunition, food, and even coal. By 1 a.m. on May 11th, Virginia's draft was nearly at the recommended 18 feet that the pilots had originally consulted the captain with, but now the pilots were saying they were unable to get Virginia up the James River since the wind was still blowing downstream. This meant that even at high tide, Virginia's draft would need to be less than 18 feet. To put it lightly, Captain Tattenhall was furious with his pilots having deceived him. He was now questioning their motives, and he was very well aware that taking Virginia into battle at this moment was even more suicidal than previous, since the wooden lower hull is now exposed, and the propeller and rudder are actually beginning to come out of the water. With most of the options having quite literally been exhausted, Virginia had two primary runners left on the table. This would be scuttling the ship or turning it into Union hands. Virginia's crew unanimously decided that they were not going to surrender the ship to the Union, as it would be quite the war prize and propaganda piece. With the decision to scuttle the ship having been made final, Captain Tattenhall broke the news to the crew. He said, "Boys, the Commodore said Norfolk has been taken by the Yankees and our supplies are cut off. Although the vessel has been lightened, the pilot says he cannot get her up the James River, as we intended to do. Therefore, we have concluded to blow her up. You can make your escape in the best way possible." However, not all of Virginia's crew got the message that they were about to ground and scuttle the ship. This meant that as Virginia began to move, some of the crew started to get into battle stations, thinking they were heading into battle, but once when they realized the vessel was steaming towards Norfolk, they either realized what was actually happening or they thought they were going to dock the vessel to defend Norfolk, but as soon as the ship hit ground, everyone got the message. Virginia ended up grounding on Cranny Island. During this time period, there are different accounts as to whether Virginia's crew was in an unorganized panic or whether they were organized and calm. Most accounts say they were organized and calm, and seeing how well the procedure played out, it's most likely the case. With the ship having been grounded, new orders started to flow through. The crew was ordered to gather on the gun deck without their personal effects, and they were to begin climbing through one of the 3 forward gun ports, and then they would enter one of the 2 lifeboats that lined the Virginia sides. Captain Tattenhall was the first man to escape. During this time period, Lieutenants Jones and Wood, along with 8 sailors, would begin preparing Virginia for her ultimate destruction. These 10 men would lay oil, fat, grease, wood, tar, and even gunpowder all over the Virginia's gun deck, all of which would begin at the ends of the casemates, and they would converge on the center of the ship over the powder magazines. This was to ensure a quick explosion that destroyed the ship. With all of the trails having been properly laid and the crew having abandoned the ship, Lieutenants Jones and Wood would begin 2 fires, one at the forward end and one at the after end of the casemate. These would be the 2 last men to escape the ship. Once when the crew was gathered on land, they began their long march to Suffolk, leaving the burning Virginia behind them. Now, an interesting story to point out is that they had actually left the guns on Virginia loaded. This meant that as the barrels heated up, the powder in the back of the barrel exploded, sending the shells out. Some of the shells flew past Virginia's crew, whilst other shells flew out into the Hampton Roads area. Shortly before 5 a.m. on May 11th, 1862, a massive explosion took place in Hampton Roads. This was the end of the Virginia. The flames had finally reached her powder magazines. With the explosion of the Virginia, the residents in Hampton Roads had lost all of their morale. Not only did the Union invade and take every single piece that the Confederacy once owned of the major naval yards in the area, but now they had just lost one of the vessels they had so much pride in 2 months prior. Whilst the Confederacy is in despair over the ship's loss, the Union is rejoicing. They had no clue what the Confederates were going to do with the Virginia, and once when they saw the flames rising out of the casemate, and then once when the ship exploded, one of their major problems was just solved.